Hello and welcome back to another video. I was listening to something the other day where they were talking about historical figures being labelled as gay, and a lot of the time the reason why they are getting labelled as gay is because they're celibate, or at least because there are no recorded instances of them having a long-term relationship or sex. And the reasoning is that because of that, and because of the attitudes against homosexuality in the past, they must have been gay and hiding it. But obviously, as we all know, there are other orientations other than heterosexuality and homosexuality. One of which is asexuality, and if we expand it to romantic orientations, aromanticism as well. And I was thinking about it, and this kind of got me to thinking about how these figures were interpreted as gay when they could have been interpreted as asexual, and maybe whether you should go about interpreting historical figures with an orientation without any direct proof. I'm also going to expand it a bit into mythological and fictional characters. Yeah, let's see how it goes. So, historical figures. Now, I think my main issue with labelling historical figures before I get into it is that obviously, unless they specifically say something which indicates their sexuality, their orientation in the language that they use in the day, it's very problematic to give them an orientation, because an orientation is something that you label yourself as. It's not a choice, obviously, it's something you're born with as a part of you, but at the same time, it is up to the individual person to decide how they want to identify. However, at the same time, it is important to recognise that there have been people across the LGBT plus spectrum throughout history, and therefore there is a benefit to regarding some people in the past, whether you have evidence or not, as a certain orientation, and pointing to them to at least say there are people who could be that orientation in the past, and there are people who have demonstrated similar attitudes and thoughts to those people of those orientations today, if that makes sense. One specific example of someone who could be interpreted as asexual, for example, is Nikola Tesla, the scientist. And one quote in particular from him about love and sex is, quote, "I do not think there is any thrill that can go through the human heart like that felt by the inventor as he sees some creation of the brain unfolding to success. Such emotions make a man forget food, sleep, friends, love, everything." And on top of that, it is supposed that Nikola Tesla died a virgin. Now, I guess in that quote he also mentions feeling the same way about food and about everything. So it's not just limited to romance and sex. But I think that I imagine he did still eat, otherwise he probably wouldn't have lived long enough to do the inventions, whereas love and romance didn't seem to be a part of his life in any way, from what I can tell from the very brief research that I've done. So yes, maybe it is valuable to consider him as an asexual and maybe aromantic person. But I think the problem is that asexuality and celibacy aren't the same thing. It's the difference between a choice that you make and your orientation. So it can be difficult to distinguish between someone who is asexual and someone who is celibate for some reason. It could be a religious reason, it could be just because they are more interested in work and in the things that they are passionate about than sex in particular. Or it could be, going back to the other point, that they were gay and they didn't feel safe to act upon it, or if they did act upon it, it was in secret. So yes, I think that's a massive minefield are talking about this sort of thing, but I just wanted to kind of cover surface level how I feel about it, because it was something I wanted to just talk about. An extension to this is mythological figures, because I think mythological figures and mythology can kind of reflect the attitudes, the general attitudes of a society. And also, myths are cool, as you probably gathered from that other video I did about sirens. One mythological figure that I wanted to talk about in particular was Artemis. Artemis is the Greek god of hunting and a bunch of other things. Among these other things is young girls and virginity. Apparently, hadn't heard those two before, to be honest. I don't know. Just seems a bit weird to me. And also, maybe, as we're going to get into later, the things that are interpreted about Artemis as being an asexual goddess could be because she is partly the goddess of virginity. And I think it's important not to conflate virginity and celibacy with asexuality, because they are very different things. So one kind of asexual thing which is linked to Artemis is the fact that when she was a child, she asked for several wishes from her father Zeus, one of which was to always remain a virgin. Now, obviously, like I've said before, celibacy and virginity, I guess, don't equal asexuality. An asexual person can be a virgin, but they can also not be a virgin. They can also be sexually active and still be asexual. But it is of note that she specifically wished to always remain a virgin, because to me that seems very asexual. It's something that a lot of ace people kind of echo today, saying, I really don't want to ever have sex. Obviously that's not all aces, but it's I would say a large proportion of the community. So I would say point in her favour being asexual. And secondly, the Artemis's hunters, like the people who hunt with her, for her. I'm not really sure about the hierarchical structure of all this. But yeah, Artemis hunters have to agree to be free from any romance or any sex in order to remain part of this group of hunters. But I guess that kind of also points towards her being an asexual goddess. This one I think is easier to justify than a historical figure, because you're not impeding on someone's right to define themselves and define their own identity. However, at the same time, I very much doubt that this was intentional. I would be very surprised if there was a significant enough portion of the population who were asexual to have a god or goddess dedicated to them or influenced in some way by them. So I imagine that this idea of her being an asexual goddess is just one, because she needs to be focusing more on hunting, and that's cementing that fact, but also that I think in a lot of societies, virginity is seen as purity. And although it obviously isn't, virginity is ridiculous and we don't need it, that may be the case why that's a part of her character, I suppose. But anyway, there's no problem with interpreting her as such, because mythological figures are there for you to interpret as you wish. And talking about the orientations of characters, I just wanted to finish off the video talking about implicit representation in fiction. And I'm going to be using two examples for this. My first example is Elsa from Frozen, the Disney film. So I've heard a lot of people say that Elsa should be lesbian, and I've also heard a lot of people say that Elsa is our ace. And I don't think necessarily there is a good enough proof for either option. Now, obviously, I am biased, and I think that it would be better if she were aro ace for representation's purposes, but at the same time, it would be amazing if she were lesbian. As long as she's not straight, it would be great. And that rhymed. We are lacking in both lesbian representation and aro ace representation. Now, obviously, this is a Disney film. I doubt we would ever get explicit asexual representation because I think that requires, in some sense, sex. So we're more talking about lesbian versus aromantic. But I think either case would be great representation. But I think at the moment it's kind of all speculative. That I don't think there's been any definitive proof, at least not from my perspective watching the two films, that she is either lesbian or aromantic. And yes, it's very good to be kind of lobbying for this and saying, hey, you should make her lesbian or aromantic, because it would be great representation, and hopefully in future films, because I imagine there will be future films, Disney listens to that. I don't trust that they will, but hopefully they do, and then there will be that great representation which will be shown to children as well. But yeah, I guess from my perspective that hasn't been a good enough reason. For Elsa's character arc in particular, the stories in Frozen haven't been about romance. I think there's a difference between someone's story being specifically about romance, but them not wanting it, and someone just having a story which doesn't happen to have romance in it. Because there is plenty of things in life that aren't romantic, and it's perfectly fine to have a story that doesn't cover that, even if the characters within that story aren't aromantic. However, that leads me quite nicely onto my second character, who is Merida from Brave. Now, Merida's story, on the other hand, I think is directly about romance. There are other aspects to it as well, for example, like family and such, but I think that a big part of that film, a big part of that story, is that there are these suitors who have come to marry her and do that, and she's not interested for one moment. I don't ever see in the film that she considers ever being interested in these people. To be fair, they are portrayed as comical, as if the audience is supposed to think that the reason Merida doesn't want to be with any of these people is because they're not worthy of her. But I think an equally valid interpretation of that is that she is just aromantic, and as part of that, she wouldn't even consider being married or in a relationship with any of these people. And I think in that case, because the story does center around romance and she shows a disdain for it, or at least a greater interest in other things, that it is more justified in talking about Merida as an aromantic character, if that makes sense. But yeah, I've rambled on far too long at this point. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below if there's any of these historical figures, mythological figures, or characters from fiction which you have an opinion of, or if there are any other examples. I guess in this video I was less talking about explicit representation and more talking about interpreting a character who is implicitly representing some facet of an orientation as that orientation. Sorry if this wasn't very well researched, I was just rambling because it was on my mind. But that's what I do here. And just a quick reminder, Aromantic Awareness Week starts next week, I believe. I have got 2 videos planned for it with 2 wonderful guests, one at the start of Aro Awareness Week and one at the end of Aro Awareness Week. I don't know why I'm finding that so hard to say. So I thought it would be a good idea to bring some Aro people onto my channel to talk about aromantic stuff and aromantic experience and aromantic issues, because that's something which I can't personally talk about from my own experience. So yeah, I hope you're looking forward to that, and I'll see you on the other side, I guess. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like. I post videos every Saturday, so if you want to see more, then feel free to subscribe. That is all I have to say today. Have a wonderful day, and I shall see you next time. So, historical figures. Hello, and welcome back to another video. I was listening to something